This is the lecture for Rawls, A Theory of Justice, sections 10 through 13. So topic number one, once again, you start the reading. It's here, chapter 2, and then we have section 10. Read the first paragraph also before we get to section 10. So just do that. Point number two, pretty soon in the reading, when you get to page 53, right at the top, he says, the first statement of the two principles reads as follows. First, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties, compatible with the similar scheme of liberties for others. Second, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all. So this, as Rawls puts it, is the first statement of the two principles of justice. And this is probably the most important two paragraphs that you'll read in all of the Rawls reading, because this is his theory of justice summed up into the two principles. This is everything that the book is about. Everything in the book is devoted to explaining this or justifying this or thinking about this or understanding this or looking at this from various positions or defending this against objections and things like that. So you always want to be thinking about how everything in the book relates back to these principles of justice, which make up the theory of justice. It's not as if this is a surprise. Like Rawls is explicit about how most stuff in the book relates to these two principles, but this is just to reiterate the point that we want to be thinking about how these principles interact with everything else that we're reading in all of the Rawls readings, from the one last time to the next Rawls reading. These are the two principles of justice. These are what the whole book is about, and these are his theory of justice summed up in two principles. But that's not to say you can just read these and sort of understand everything. Like, it's fine if you read this and it's not clear what justice is or what the theory is or anything. Like, as Rawls says in the next sentence, there are two ambiguities in the second principle, namely blah, blah, blah. I'll talk about these more. So again, since the whole book is about this stuff, you're not supposed to understand everything just by reading these sentences. You still have to read other stuff to get the idea. These are just a summary and a sort of encapsulation of everything. And so these are the starting point, and you want to be constantly returning to these and thinking about these in light of all the other stuff that you're reading. So again, two very, very, very important paragraphs on page 53. The third point. So in this reading, Rawls will talk a lot about the difference principle. And so first I'm going to explain the difference principle just so you have a sort of easy explanation before you read the more detailed stuff Rawls says. And then I'm going to say something which is going on in the background, which Rawls never says explicitly, but it's kind of important. So first, the difference principle relates to the second principle of justice. And so the second principle of justice is social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they're reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage. And this part is the difference principle. And just to make things simple, instead of talking about like every social and economic inequality, we're just going to talk about income. We're going to pretend income is the only relevant thing. Again, this is not Rawls's view. Rawls is talking about social and economic inequalities broadly speaking, but we're just going to use income as our sort of simple example. So the difference principle says that from the point of view of justice, equality is the baseline, and you only depart from equality if this would be to the benefit of whoever is in the worst off position. So in our current society, we don't have equal incomes. We have very unequal incomes. Some people make a lot of money. Some people make very little money. Some people make in between, etc. The difference principle says that is unjust. The only just arrangement is everybody has equal income, or if there are any inequalities, these benefit whoever is worst off. So for instance, imagine we have a society where everybody earns 500 rupees. That would be okay according to the difference principle because that's equality. And then we have a possibility of paying some people 900 rupees, or this is per day, so 500 rupees per day. Some people could instead earn 900 rupees per day, and then everybody else would earn 700 rupees per day. Is that okay? Well, that's unequal. Now some people are earning 700 and some people are earning 900. but it benefits the worst off people. The worst off people used to be at 500, now they're at 700, so that's fine. So moving everybody from 500 to some people at 7, some people at 9, that's fine according to the difference principle. So that's the difference principle. And then the thing that's sort of operating in the background that I think Rawls is assuming, well, I don't think Rawls is, which Rawls is assuming, number one, he doesn't say it, I think, because he thinks it's just too obvious to be worth mentioning. And number two, he doesn't say it because technically the difference principle doesn't care sort of how you accomplish making everybody or making the worst off person better off. It just says if inequality makes the worst off person better off, then it's fine, and who cares how that happens. But there is a sort of like typical way this might happen in a society, which Rawls has in the back of his mind, and people reading Rawls will have in the back of their mind. And so you want to have this in the back of your mind so that you understand what's going on. Great. So imagine that we have a society where everybody earns 500 rupees per day. Some jobs are pretty hard, like being a doctor, maybe. You're sort of responsible for life and death, and you have to go to school for many years before you're a doctor. And it's very stressful. Or maybe being a farmer, you're out in the fields all day and it's very strenuous. And so in a society where everybody earns 500 rupees per day, maybe we won't have many doctors or farmers. Some people will have a passion for this and they'll do it anyways. But most people will say, that's a lot of work. I'm going to do something less stressful with my life. Also, imagine that doctors and farmers are sort of very good for society. So, it helps all of us if we have more doctors. It helps all of us if we have more farmers. That means we have food and medical care and stuff. So it might make sense to say, look, let's pay the doctors and the farmers 900 rupees per day. And that's sort of going to make everybody in society better off, including the worst off people. The worst off people, let's say they were spending 200 rupees per day on medicine. Now they don't have to spend that because they have doctors. It's as if they're now earning 700 rupees per day. Their sort of effective income went up by 200. So that would be a case where inequality makes the worst off better off. So again, from the point of view of the difference principle, it doesn't matter if like this is how it works or it happens some other way, whatever. But like this is, I think, supposed to be a pretty plausible hypothetical. We pay some people more to do a socially important job, and that makes everybody, including the worst off, better off. So that would be a case where the difference principle would say inequality is okay, a relatively plausible case. And so that's just operating in the background, and it's good to have that in the back of your mind as you read what Rawls says about the difference principle in these sections. Point number 4 on the lecture outline, economics jargon. So Rawls uses some terms from economics which you may not use, and it's good to know those before you read the sections. So first, indifference curves. He actually draws an indifference curve here on page 59, but the first time he calls it an indifference curve is on page 65, I think. He just says, assume that indifference curves, blah, blah, blah. So what is an indifference curve? It's what it sounds like, except that's not very helpful, because what does that sound like? But number one, they're curves, so that's very straightforward. So notice this thing is a curve. But it doesn't have to literally be curved. It can be straight. It's just a line, an indifference line. And indifference in indifference curves means we are indifferent as to any point on the curve, in the sense that any point on the curve is just as good in terms of whatever our standards are as any other point. So if this is our indifference curve, point A is just as good as point D, is just as good as point B. Any of these points are equally good. Any point off the curve is either not as good or it's not possible. So an indifference curve is just a curve made up of points which are all equally good. Good along what standard? Well, it doesn't matter, whatever, any standard. The most common usage of indifference curves in economics is according to the standard of like buying stuff. Like they use indifference curves to model consumer preferences. Rawls is not talking about that. He's not charting consumer preferences anywhere in this book. He actually tells you what he's going to use indifference curves to plot on 65. He says, assume that indifference curves represent distributions that are judged equally just. But whatever. An indifference curve is just a curve that plots a bunch of points which are all equally good from some point of view. So those are indifference curves. Another piece of jargon Rawls uses, which you don't actually have to understand this, but it can be confusing to see words you don't understand, so I'm going to explain them anyways. Is interpersonal cardinal axes. He says this assumes an interpersonal cardinal interpretation of the axes at one point. So what does it mean to have interpersonal cardinal axes? So, we've got some charts. We have the x-axis down here, the horizontal axis, and the y-axis over here, the vertical axis. And then on the vertical axis, we're charting this person x2, how good they're doing. And over here, we're on the x-axis, we're charting this person x1, how good they're doing. We go from 0 to whatever. When we say these are interpersonal axes, what we mean is that x1 and x2 are sort of measuring, the two axes measuring x1 and x2, they can sort of be compared against each other. So when we put them on the chart, going up is good for x2 and going to the right is good for x1. Going up and to the right is good for both of them. Going down and to the left is bad for both of them. And so we're sort of like, we can trade off between them and stuff like that. We can graph both of them against each other. So that just means we're making interpersonal comparisons of them. And when he says cardinal, he just means we can use like cardinal numbers to do this. So like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that means like a 1 down here on the x-axis for x1 is equivalent to a 1 over here on the y-axis for x2. Again, this does not matter. You don't need to understand this to understand what Rawls is saying, but sometimes it helps. Finally, he uses the word expectations all over this book. Expectations has a number of meanings in English. One common meaning in like normal English is just your desires or whatever. If we say somebody has like high expectations, it means they want, they're very demanding. They expect a lot from people. So if I want everybody to treat me like a king or whatever, I have very high expectations. That's not the sense in which Rawls is using the term, or in which economists are using the term in the relevant sense. Expectations in this book just means predictions. So specifically, an expectation is like an accurate prediction of what's going to happen given certain circumstances. So like if we set things up according to, I don't know, this chart or whatever, expectations are just whatever's charted on the chart. Like you expect to happen whatever the chart says is going to happen. So expectations are just how you think things are going to turn out. That has nothing to do with what you want. Like, if I have high expectations, I want to be treated like a king in the normal English sense of the term, expectations. That doesn't mean I necessarily have high expectations in Rawls' sense, because Rawls is talking about how things are going to work. And so people are not going to treat me like a king. So I don't expect that people will treat me like a king in the Rawls sense of expectations. I expect that people will treat me just like a normal person. So those are expectations. Those are predictions of what's going to happen. The last point is Pareto efficiency, or Pareto optimality. So Rawls explains Pareto optimality, Pareto efficiency, but I'm also going to explain it just because sometimes it helps to have things explained twice. So he said he's called Pareto optimality. I shall always use the term efficiency, and he explains why it doesn't matter. We're just going to call it Pareto efficiency or Pareto optimality, whatever. The principle holds that a configuration is efficient or optimal whenever it's impossible to change it so as to make some persons, at least one, better off, without at the same time making other persons, at least one, worse off. So let's say I have 10 rupees to divide up. I give you 5 and I give me 5. That is Pareto efficient. That is Pareto optimal, because I can't make you better without making myself worse, without taking some rupees from me. And I can't make myself better without making you worse, without taking some rupees from you. Similarly, if we have 10 rupees to divide up and I give 10 to you and 0 to me, that's also Pareto optimal. That's Pareto efficient. I can't make you better at all, like you've got all of them. And I can't make me better without making you worse. I'd have to take from you and give to me. Let's say we have 10 rupees to divide up and I give you 3 and I give me 3. That is not Pareto efficient. That is not Pareto optimal, because I could make you better. I've only used up 6 rupees. I could make you better by giving you more rupees without making me worse. I could make me better without making you worse. I can make both of us better without making either of us worse. So Pareto optimality is when you can't make anybody better without making somebody worse. Now we come to the part in the lecture where I'm going to explain the figures in the book. You might find it helpful to pause here and return after you've sort of seen each figure. So, do the reading up until you get to figure 3, try to figure out figure 3 on your own, come back to the video. Do the reading, try to figure out figure 4, come back to the video. Maybe you'll do the whole reading and then come back to the video and get all the figures explained. Maybe you want to hear the explanation first and then do the reading. Maybe watch the video again after. I don't know. It's up to you. But you may want to stop the lecture now and read first. Here is figure 3. Figure 3 is a graph of Pareto optimality. This curve is the Pareto optimal curve. Anything above this curve is not possible because we don't have enough resources to do it. And anything below this curve is not Pareto efficient. It's not Pareto optimal. So point B is Pareto optimal, or Pareto efficient. Point D is Pareto efficient. Point A is Pareto efficient. This point B is giving everything to this person x2. Point A is giving everything to this person x1. Point D is giving, this much, little a to x1 and little b to x2. These are all Pareto efficient. Over here, let's say we're at point D and we try to go to the right to give more to x1. We don't have enough resources. Similarly, if we're at point D and we try to go up, give more to x2, we don't have enough resources. If we're at point B and we try to go up, we don't have enough resources. If we're at point A, we try to go up or to the right, we don't have a... So out here, we can't get here. And inside, we are not Pareto efficient because let's say I'm at this point. I could go up and give more to x2 without taking from x1. I could go to the right and give more to x1 without taking from x2. I could go up and to the right and give more to both of them without taking from either. So this is just Pareto efficiency. This is the same graph except with a dotted line, dashed line added down the middle at 45 degrees. This is the line of equality. So everywhere along this line, you're giving equal resources to both of them, x1 and x2. Rawls just uses this line to say, look, Pareto efficiency is maybe not the only thing you could care about. For instance, point D is just as Pareto efficient as point C, but it's much closer to equality. Notice, up here at C, x2 is getting most stuff. So you might think point D is better than point C, not because it's more Pareto efficient, but because it's more equal. Pareto efficiency is rarely the only thing you care about. He says you might even prefer point F over point C. Point F is not Pareto efficient, but it is more equal than point C, so maybe it's better. So that's just to point out that Pareto efficiency is not the only thing you might care about. Down to figure 5. Figure 5 makes use of indifference curves, and it helps to think about, there's different sets of indifference curves, and they're sort of shaped like L's. So, and I altered the graph by making the middle line red to make it stand out more. So here's one set of indifference curves, relatively near the origin. So these two right angles. Or these two vertical lines, these two straight lines, one vertical, one horizontal, meeting at a right angle. This is one indifference curve. This is another indifference curve, these two lines, which are up and to the right. And then these two lines, which are up and to the right. And then these two lines, which are up and to the... So these are different sets of indifference curves. So different sort of distributions of stuff. And we're imagining, let's say this indifference curve, you have, so these are sort of different sets of indifference curves. And notice they all meet here along this 45-degree line. And this 45-degree line is equality. So you're giving equal resources to both x1 and x2. Now, let's, ignoring this 45-degree line for a moment, we have these sort of right angle meeting indifference curves. And the ones closer to the upper right, these are sort of better in this, they're better because they're more. Up here, x1 and x2 both have more everywhere on this indifference curve in the upper right, compared to down here. At the very high point of this indifference curve, x2 has a lot, just like over here, but x1 is always going to have very little on this part of the indifference curve. And then we can go out to this part of the indifference curve and give x1 much more, but this gives x2 very little. And so what is this this 45-degree line charting? This 45-degree line, Rawls says, is charting the difference principle. The difference principle, recall, says we want equal distribution unless departure from equality would make the worst off person better. So equality is our baseline, 45 degrees is our baseline, and unless we can do better for whoever's worse off, we don't want to depart from equality. So let's imagine x1 is the person who is doing worse off. When is x1 the person who is doing worse off? Well, it's this part of the indifference curve, or sorry, this part of the chart, everything above the 45-degree line. Everything above the 45-degree line, x1 and x2 are doing equally. Below the 45-degree line, x1 is doing better, because if we're on the 45-degree line and we go below it, we're giving more to x1, but we're not changing x2. So below the 45-degree line, x1 is doing better. But let's restrict ourselves to above the 45-degree line, where x2 is doing better, because we're going above 45 degrees. We're adding to x2, but we're not adding to x1. So let's say we're here, we're at the equal point, and then, so we're on this indifference curve, and then we know x2 is doing better. So where do we want to go on this indifference curve from the point of view of the difference principle? Or sorry, what is a better indifference curve than this from the point of view of the difference principle? Well, the better indifference curves are over here and over here and over here and over here. Like these higher indifference curves are up and to the right. But notice they're all to the right of this one. They're all shifted to the right. So in order to get from this indifference curve, and we're on this part of it because we're above the 45-degree line because x1 is doing worse. In order to get from this indifference curve to a better indifference curve, to like a nicer indifference curve, we would have to go to the right. We would have to give more to x1. But remember, we're assuming we're sort of x2 is doing better. So we're sort of stuck on this indifference curve unless we move along the 45-degree line and also give more to x1 as we give more to x2. I actually don't know if I just explained that very well. To get to the next indifference curve, we need to move to the right, and that requires giving more to x1. By hypothesis, we're sort of holding x1 fixed on this indifference curve, and we're holding x1 fixed to this part of the indifference curve because we're assuming x1 is doing worse than x2. So we're sort of stuck on this part of the indifference curve, and the difference principle says we only want to move along equality unless we'll make the worst off person better off, x1. But we can't make the worst off person better off. We're stuck on this part. We're assuming they're worse off always. So we're stuck on this part. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, it kind of doesn't matter. Like the chart is just to illustrate the difference principle, and the difference principle you can understand in words, but that's the basic thought. So this chart is sort of illustrating that we stick to equality unless we can make the worst off person better. And so similarly, let's assume x1 is doing better than x2. So we're sort of staying in the bottom right-hand corner. These are the only relevant indifference curves, these horizontal lines. And so to get to a better horizontal line, you have to move up. You have to make x2 better. But the only movement up is either along the equal axis or up here, where x2 is doing better than x1. I hope that made sense. I don't know. I think if you watch it 3 times, maybe that'll make sense. So that's figure 5. Here's figure 6. Figure 6, we're assuming x1 is doing better than x2. So we're, again, ignoring this part of the chart where x2 is doing better than x1. So the only relevant parts are equality or x1 is doing better. And again, we have these indifference curves, these horizontal ones, where we're happy to move upwards because this will make x2 do better. And we're stuck in this part of the chart because x1 is always going to be better than x2. And then this little curve, this OP curve, this is charting what happens to x2's money or income or whatever as we give more to x1. So as we move along the x-axis and give more to x1, this is how much extra is being added to x2. this little line. So if we give 0 to x1, x2 gets 0 extra. If we give a little more to x1, x2 gets this much. So like, let's say this is 2. Let's say it's, whatever. This is 2, this is like 1.5. Let's say we give 3 to x1, x2 gets 2.5. Let's say we get 4 to x1, x2 will get 3. Let's say we get 4.5 to x1, x2 gets like 3.5. Oh no, so the more we get x1, the better x2 is doing, up until we hit this point. Once we hit this point, as we start to give even more to x1, x2 is getting less. So, let's say we give 7 to x1, and this gives 1, 2, 3. This gives like 4 to x2. Now we give 8 to x1, but we're down to like, I don't know, 3.8 to x2. So this is the best point from x2's point of view in terms of how much extra to give x1. And so this sort of gets us to the highest indifference curve for x2, which is, I don't know, 3 extra to x2 or whatever. The numbers are all just, they don't matter. So this point A is how much extra you give to x1, because that maximizes the extra to x2. And x2, remember, is doing worse than x1 at every point because we're below the 45-degree angle. So the difference principle says we're going to depart from equality. Equality is the 45-degree angle. And we're going to go to this point because it's the highest indifference curve from x2's point of view. x2 gets to get up here, which is as good as x2 can do when we give more to x1. So this charts when the difference principle tells you to depart from equality. Or not when, but like it tells you how to depart from equality. You depart from it by giving as much to x1 as will give the maximum to x2. Figure 7, we're no longer talking about the difference principle, or Rawls. Where, as Rawls puts it, he talks about a view which is less egalitarian than the difference principle and perhaps more plausible at first sight. And it's a view where things are like often depicted this way. And so we're imagining like a different principle of justice about how to divide things up. Again, we have a bunch of indifference curves, but instead of being right angles like they were up here, instead of being a bunch of like L shapes, they're little curves. And again, the ones in the upper right are sort of like better for everybody. They have more resources for everybody. So this is like a rich society up here. This is a much less rich society down here. And so, along each curve, you're happy with any of the points on the curve, but it would be nice if you could get to a higher curve, but that's irrelevant for us here. Let's assume, let's look at this curve, this second curve up here. I've drawn in this red line, by the way. Let's look at this second curve right here and imagine this is our society. So this is the indifference curve. We have two people, x2 and x1, and we're happy with any of these sorts of distributions. We can give x1 quite a bit over here, or we can do x2 quite a bit over here, or we can give sort of equal amounts to both of them, and it's a bit lower, but whatever. And so we're happy with any of these distributions. This is not charting Rawls's theory. This is charting like some other, he thinks like more common principles of justice or whatever, what other people think. Now, before we look at this curvy line, let's look at this straight line that I've drawn. This straight line, I don't know, it should actually probably be something. I don't know. This straight line is what a utilitarian would draw. What does the straight line depict? Well, let's say this is 5 up here, and this is 5 down here. So this is like a 45-degree angle, not equality up here, or sorry, not a 45-degree angle like this, but a 45-degree angle like this. The utilitarian says we can give 5 to x2, or 5 to x1, or 2.5 to each of them, or 3 to one of them and 2 to the other. I don't care. It's all the same to me because it all adds up to 5. I just want the maximum, and it's 5 no matter where you go. It all adds up to 5 no matter where you go. So fine, I'm a utilitarian. I'm fine with anything along the line. Most people are not intuitively utilitarians. Most people, Rawls thinks, are intuitively this sort of curve. What does this sort of curve depict? Well, let's imagine we're down here and we're a utilitarian. The utilitarian says, look, this is 5 total. I'd be happy for 5 total to go equally to both of them, or 5 total to go to x1. Most people, if you give them that choice, they say, no, if you have 5 total stuff, split it up equally in society. The only way I want to give everything to x1 is if you get like way more than 5. I don't know, if you're way out here at 10 or something, if you can sort of double it or whatever, if you can make things so much better, then sure, give basically everything to x1. Maybe that's much more efficient. But it's got to be much better for x1 in order to depart from equality, even though equality is sort of getting us less stuff. So what are the points I am indifferent to? So what am I equally happy with? Well, I'm equally happy with equality, or really, really good for x1 and not so great for x2. But again, it's got to be really good for x1 to compensate x2. And then similarly, the utilitarian says, okay, equal to both of them, or give all 5 to x2. I'm fine with that. Rawls says no. The typical person will say, look, if you're going to depart from like 2.5 for each of them, I want it to go all the way up to like 10 or whatever if you're giving most or all of it to x2. It's got to be like really good for x2 for that to be worth it. So this is why Rawls thinks the typical person's indifference curve is sort of curved like this, rather than a 45-degree angle like the utilitarians, where it's just, who cares how it's divided up as long as you have the same maximum. So that's figure 7. Figure 8 is maybe the most confusing because Rawls says, I'm going to use figure 8 to talk about what utilitarian wants to happen. To understand how utilitarianism works, we're going to start with this 45-degree line that I've drawn. But since for the utilitarian, like, you know, x1 and x2 are equally good, we don't care how it's split up, you know, anywhere on this 45-degree line is fine. To make the chart sort of more helpful, we're going to imagine x2 is like a bunch of people. Let's say there's like 10 people over here, and then there's just one person who's x1. So now, if you are at a 5 over here on x2 versus a 5 down here on x1, a 5 over here on x2 is going to get multiplied by 10 because there's 10 people on x2. So it's like 10 times as good to give 5 units to x2. So this will be like a 50 or whatever. So, I mean, I probably shouldn't have said 10. Let's make it like 2 people. So a 5 over here is going to be worth 10 or whatever. So instead of having a 45-degree line where you have 5 and 5, they're both equal, this will be like a 10 or something. And this will be a 5 because it's just worth 1 to give it to x1, where it's worth 2 times as much to give it to x2. So then what is your indifference curve as a utilitarian? You're no longer going to be happy with this curve because this curve says, oh, it's just as good to give 5 to x2 as it is to give them to x1. But no, actually, you'll be happy giving 2.5 to x2 because it's twice as good to give it to x2. So for the price of giving 5 to x1, you'll be willing to give 2.5 to x2 because you get double your money basically because there's 2 people over on x2. So Rawls says, let's imagine there's more people in x2. That's going to slant the utilitarian's line down like this. And so that's why Rawls has a bunch of these slanted lines drawn. These are the utilitarians' indifference curve. So what does the utilitarian want to do? Well, now we have this line from up here from Rawls's difference principle. And the utilitarian takes a look at the line and they say, what do I want to do? Well, the utilitarian, my indifference curves are these 45-degree line, or not these 45-degree line, these slanted lines that I've now drawn. And notice what's the highest indifference curve you can get to for the utilitarian? It's this one. And this is over here. It intersects with this curve at point A. So for the sake of x2, to make x2 like better off, we give x1 even more than Rawls gave x1. Rawls gave, you know, the doctors or whatever this much. The utilitarian will give them this much because this will multiply x2's money by like more or whatever, and there's more people in x2. And so why is Rawls charting this? Well, this is just to show that there are cases where the utilitarian will be happy with paying x1 even more compared to x2, so make things even more unequal. But that's fine because there's more people in x2 and they're doing better enough that it sort of gets multiplied, and you know, so the total utility gets larger. So Rawls's only point really here to illustrate is that utilitarianism allows other things equal larger inequalities. So that's really all he wants to chart there. But just figuring out why the line ends up sloping, you know, like this is a little confusing. So hopefully I explained that. So those are all the figures, and if you understood none of that, that's quite all right because he explains everything in text, so it should make sense either way. So this may have been a waste of time, but that's okay.